When President Biden announced he'd cancel up to $20,000 of student loan debt for each college student, many dorms probably erupted in celebration. But is this massive gift to the university constituency really wise? Then looking at the K-12 world, we have hard evidence now that keeping kids out of the classroom tanked their test scores. Of course, teachers' unions pushed hard to keep the schools closed as long as possible, but at what cost to students? There's a lot more to talk about, and we will discuss these issues and lots more on today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everyone. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try to bring you an independent take on the issues of the day. As always, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Williamson Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill Evers.
How are you?
It's great to see you. And today, especially, we are privileged to have with us another one of our colleagues, but he's usually at a distance. It's Dr. Philip Magnus, who is a research fellow here. Hello, Dr. Magnus.
Hi.
Great to see you. And let me just remind our friends that you are not only a research fellow here, but a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, which is in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So he's giving us a bi-coastal perspective here between all three of us. And Dr. Magnus holds a PhD in history, economic history from George Mason University. He's published a number of really interesting books. Is it the case still that you have a forthcoming title called Cracks in the Ivory Tower? Is that right, Phil Magnus?
It is. Cracks in the Ivory Tower is already out. So
it's already out. Okay.
Our take on higher education and the moral mess that has basically infected our university system.
Well, I want to get that book in my hands then now that it's out, especially because the subtitle is intriguing. The Bad Business Ethics of Higher Education. Sounds good to me. Looking forward to seeing that. And of course, Phil Magnus also has published in quite a number of professional journals and popular journals like Newsweek and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and so forth. And most recently, something that we will come back to in a few minutes, Phil Magnus published a piece with us at the Independent Institute and on AIER on weird happenings at the American Historical Society. Check that one. We're coming back to that one pretty soon here. But let's start off with another college-related subject, which is to say this wonderful news. Well, I guess some students took it as wonderful news that their student debt would get canceled. President Biden, I guess he's fulfilling a campaign promise. And in that respect, I guess one should give him credit. But boy, was it a wise promise? I mean, apparently you get $10,000 knocked off your debt if you had a federal loan for college, $20,000 if you also happen to be the recipient of a Pell Grant, which of course quite a few people were. And so, wow, that's a pretty good deal. But then I'm thinking to myself, what if I was on the other end of that equation? What if I was one of those kids who said, I better be careful about taking on debt, and maybe I'll go to a cheaper college. Like if I was that kid, I'd be kicking myself now. What do you say to that, Bill Evers?
Well, there's also lower tuition that's going to be charged for people with certain job destinations that's going to add up a huge amount that people don't even talk about that much. And there's all the
I don't
people,
understand how that works.
There's all the people that have been taking on jobs, or their parents went into debt to pay for them, and people who've already paid off student loans. They think, oh, I'm a chump of some sort. These other people are getting a special deal, and I'm not. Many people, including many prominent Democrats, warned Biden beforehand that this was possibly a gravedigger for him, that it could really boomerang against him. On the other hand, some people on the left, who you might think, since this is really a redistribution from the people who are working class and don't have a college education, and to benefit the college educated who are going to have high incomes later on in life. But anyway, people on the left who supposedly are for the impoverished, said, well, you're not giving enough to the soon-to-be wealthy. And so, why aren't you forgiving all debt? And why aren't you, anyway, that's what the maximal thing that they want. So he might get away with it because it seems like to give away and to explain how stupid it is a bit complicated. But I think the bare bones thing that people contract for something and now they're getting out of paying for it strikes a man in the street, woman in the street as unfair. The fact that many people knock themselves out to be very prudent and careful, and now they seem to be kind of slapped in the face, may also resound with the man in the street. I think it'll turn out to be a bad idea for him. The other weird thing is they claim they paid for it through their bogus deficit reduction plan. And then therefore they can spend the money twice. They take out a $50,000 loan, and then the next year they can spend that on a $50,000 vacation as if that loan problem has not gone away. They're singing a song for themselves. That's just crazy.
Well, Phil Magnus, you know a lot about economics. Can you talk about how the moral and the economic dimensions kind of work together for ill here, maybe?
This is a classic case of what economists refer to as a moral hazard. Basically, the government has offered a giveaway to people who behaved irresponsibly. And that's going to further encourage people to behave irresponsibly. So you look at something like student loan forgiveness, it's basically a giant middle finger to anyone that conscientiously planned their budget, took out debt in a responsible way, and made their payments to pay it back. So what Biden is doing here, he's rewarding the worst actors, and he's doing so also in a very regressive way. Because if you look at
regressive, what do you mean by regressive exactly?
Oh, if you look at the people that are actually holding student debt and some of the categories as well in this measure, it has a very high income threshold to allow you to be eligible for it. Most of the debt that's being forgiven is from people that come from upper middle class backgrounds, and yet that's being taken out of taxpayers who are definitely not in that same category. A lot of it is going to pay for debt that was taken on to finish graduate degrees or professional degrees, to get a law degree in some examples. Other cases, to get a PhD, often in fields that are very oversaturated in the number of PhD seekers and don't have much in the way of career prospects. But you have people that are taking out $100,000 in debt to get an English or a poetry PhD or a philosophy or a history PhD. No offense to
electricians subsidizing exactly dentists, doctors, and accountants.
Yeah, and people that want to be academics. And the other thing that's really coming through on this, and I think we're going to see this for some time to come, there's been ample evidence that whenever the federal government has gotten involved in the subsidy of student loans in the past, the effect of that is to pass through the benefit into the colleges. What colleges do is they raise their tuition at a commensurate amount. So the tuition hikes that we've seen over the last several decades are basically directly fueled by government subsidized loans. Now we're forgiving those loans. It's like throwing gasoline onto an already burning fire.
That phenomenon that Phil just described even has a name called the Bennett thesis or Bennett hypothesis, named for a former U.S. Secretary of Education, William Bennett, who suggested that this is what the colleges were doing, taking these college student aid and using it as a simple excuse for raising tuition and getting away with it.
So I'm a financial aid officer at a college and you're a prospective student and you're saying to me that you're afraid of, costing too much. And I'm going to say to you now, hey, guy or gal, the government's forgiven a lot of these student loans now. Just take extra loans. I mean, it's a little bit of rolling the dice, but, the precedent's been set. And so, don't worry. Take on the extra loan. Take on the extra debt. I mean, my institution that I work for.
Exactly this perverse incentive to overload the loans. Right.
Yeah.
We will gladly receive the proceeds of your student loan from the U.S. Treasury. Never fear. We'll take the money in.
But also take out loans for your living expenses and all sort of
Oh,
other
that
things.
too, yeah.
Or extend your graduation date. Go on the 5 or 6 year plan instead of the 4-year plan. You can stay around here for a couple more years, take some electives, spend your loan money on it, and have a good time partying.
Yeah, so it's clear that, you know, there's a huge unfairness. It's a huge justice issue. Dare I call it, this is a social injustice, this loan cancellation thing. But that at the same time, apparently, I'm hearkening back to what Bill said a few moments ago, the Biden administration is claiming that even though it could add up to what, like $1.7 trillion, I don't know what it is. It's huge. No, I haven't got that wrong. They say, the White House says it's only going to cost $24 billion, according to what I read in the Wall Street Journal. And so that's going to be offset by other reductions in the federal deficit. How could it be?
It's going to be
$24 billion,
much more than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so how could $24 billion or even that much, or could be more, how can they have no effect on the overall economic situation of the country and of the U.S. Treasury?
There's a real problem here. Now, there's some divided opinions on what it's going to do for the budgetary strains, but I think everyone agrees that it is probably going to well exceed the bare minimum projections that the Biden administration is putting out there. Jason Furman, who was President Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, actually called them out and said, this is going to contribute to our already existing inflationary crisis. Now, he's using a Keynesian model to predict that, and there's some certain assumptions that go into it, but it's certainly a plausibility that Biden has not taken into account, or probably more likely doesn't even care about.
Here's something I read also in the Wall Street Journal telling me that the Penn Wharton School budget model, which is a kind of ongoing budget model initiative, estimates that it could cost as much as $1 trillion to forgive all these loans over time, not just the what was it, $24 billion that the White House estimated. That's pretty stunning, really. I mean, that's got to have a huge impact on everyone's finances. And at the same time, there's another angle we haven't even gotten to, and I'll just mention it and see what you think, Bill Evers. But don't I recall that Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said last year sometime, when the idea was floated about before, that the president really doesn't have legal authority to do this. Now, apparently she's gone mute on the subject, but you do wonder, there's been no act of Congress passed. We're getting into a $1 trillion expenditure, only on the say-so of the president, no checks and balances, no appropriations, no budget voted on. How can this be constitutionally, even legally valid?
Talk about some kind of Rube Goldberg mechanism to try and justify this. They took a thing that has to do with first responders. It's called the HEROES Act, and it's trying to alleviate their distress during the pandemic and lockdown. And then they constructed out of that this loan move that applies to all the people that fit into the multitude of categories. And, you know, yes, not just Nancy Pelosi, lots of people have said the president has no power to do this, and certainly without an act of Congress. So there's going to be legal pushback on this. I'm not sure exactly who's going to have standing, but somebody will.
We should speculate on that.
I really can't believe that courts are going to do this.
So, Phil Magnus, who would have standing, do you think, to sue to contest this cancellation?
Yeah, that is a really tricky question here. But I would say that we're probably going to see some people that did repay their loans. Some people,
I'm thinking that,
acted in responsible ways, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, how come I don't get this handout from the government?"
Okay, equal protection violation.
Exactly.
In that respect, maybe. But maybe also members of Congress could claim it was a constitutional violation. That is to say, the legislative process spelled out in the Constitution was violated. by this action. I wouldn't be surprised if there are several cases making their way up to at least the appeals court level, and maybe the U.S. Supreme Court, ending up, if it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court in particular, invalidating this on jurisdictional grounds. Yeah. But then, of course, that takes time.
It's possible that members of Congress have a right to sue under this.
That's what I was thinking. Exactly.
I do think it's a very bizarre thing at a time we see the federal government generally stepping back from pandemic lockdowns and emergencies, and then using this as their shaky platform.
But the question is, if this worked its way through the courts and if the action were invalidated legally, then there's, of course, a question of equity in retroactive application of the remedy, I would think. So, by the time it gets, let's say, to the U.S. Supreme Court and the Supreme Court strikes this action down, a whole bunch of people will have gotten their loans forgiven at the cost of the U.S. Treasury. Can those people's loans balances be reinstituted after having been forgiven? I doubt it. But all of that will happen after the midterms are voted on and done.
Exactly. It's rushed this through before the election as this freebie, this handout to the constituency that the left is really seeking, which is college students, but especially upper middle class.
Trying to mobilize young people.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it almost, say it again.
Yeah, don't worry about the consequences. We'll deal with those after November.
Yeah, not only, but we'll take care of you.
Exactly.
The perennial message of Washington, D.C. is we'll take care of you, right? So, hey, kids, don't worry. We'll take care of you. And that's a way, I guess, to mobilize a key constituency for the Democratic Party. It's hard to believe that they could actually be consciously thinking of it so cravenly, but I'm afraid it's hard to entirely dismiss that hypothesis, that explanatory hypothesis. Yeah. Let's turn to another sector of education. Bill Evers, can you tell us what the organization is called, or the assessment called National Assessment of Educational Progress? What is NAEP, and what has it told us recently about learning at the K-12 level?
Well, it's as you say, it's a K-12 test assessment, and it's sponsored by the federal government, and it's somewhat independent. There's an independent board that manages it, and it takes stock periodically of student results in various subject matter areas such as math, science, English language arts, all these different things. And we just had so there's a short run test and a long run test. The long run test is the more reliable because it's less subject to fads. And so we have long run math results. And so between 2020 and 2022, math fell 7 points. And this is to lows that haven't been observed in the United States for decades. So blacks fell 13 points, Latinos fell 8 points, and Asians and whites only fell 6 and 5 points.
Over what time span again? What's the time span we're talking?
This is from 20 to 22.
Okay.
So there's another interesting phenomenon here, and that is that the public school system and its apologists say, oh, well, yes, we didn't do the lockdowns perfectly. We didn't do remote learning perfectly, but that's all this is, and everything will spring back. People estimate that, they've maybe gotten 30% back, some people at a conference that I was just listening to today. But clearly this is going to be with us for, they're going to be into college. There's going to be a generation that's harmed by this. And they're using this as an excuse to mask the fact that NAEP results have been drooping for a while. So going back to Common Core, which was put into effect in 2010, put into existence in 2010, but really the first tests that reflected are tests that began in 2013. So the problems that we're having in math and science and English are not really new with the pandemic. They're actually exacerbating the problems that the K-12 system has had. So not only do they not have solid curriculum, but they don't really have incentives and accountability. So they're not really goaded to use the most effective methods. And if they're not good and effective teachers or administrators, they don't face any consequences. So we have a disastrous public school system.
So, but I suppose the argument from the other side is, well, it's all COVID's fault.
I just said
and you can't control.
It's not.
But it's not.
I just said, Graham, that this problem existed beforehand because of Common Core and because of the incentive structure.
But got exacerbated.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, not by COVID, but by the way that the schools were closed down for an extended period on account of the COVID scare. So you have these two things operating together, I think is what you're saying, Bill, the weakness of the curriculum and then the craziness of the response in the schools.
They first of all, beginning in spring of 2020, it was clear that the schools should all have been reopened, that they weren't prepared to do distance learning and that they were blowing it. And so they continued to blow it for 2 more years. And so we should not be surprised that there's this learning deficit. And by the way, the teachers' unions and public school administrators said, we can't use the word learning loss. We're learning new things. Just laughable stuff.
Repackage it.
Yeah,
well, Phil Magnus, would there have been another way of handling the schools other than the lockdowns? I mean, what were the alternatives during the crisis?
I was basically screaming from the rooftops all the way back in April 2020 that this was the wrong way to go. What we had here was a path dependency that was set in, and it all goes back to those junk epidemiology models that Fauci and both the U.S. and U.K. government and eventually governments worldwide embraced at the beginning of the pandemic. They were all premised upon schools being a major vector of disease spread. In fact, there's even some emails that have come out through Freedom of Information Act showing public health officials in the U.S. Carter Meacher was the main person at the Veterans Administration, but passing on to Fauci, where he's saying that if we just shut down the schools, this will all go away. This is the core to solving the problem. And it turns out he was using a decades-old influenza model that was premised upon the locus of the spread being among school children. Well, it turns out COVID's the exact opposite of that.
Right.
It's the most vulnerable were the elderly, and children had basically the lowest vulnerability rate. But because we locked into that path dependency of this completely untested, unjustified, unwarranted epidemiology modeling scare, it was almost impossible to get rid of it. Then you had the constituencies, such as the teachers' unions, moved in behind it and discovered suddenly they enjoyed working from home. They enjoyed only having 2 or 3 day work weeks where they're dialing in over Zoom.
And they enjoyed the leverage. You know,
Absolutely.
you started seeing the Los Angeles union saying, oh, well, unless we have socialized medicine for all, unless we end charter schools, unless we do X, Y, and Z, we're not returning to work. Forget it.
That was a completely unexpected piece of good fortune, you might say, for their agenda that the epidemic seemed to give them. I'm not sure it really did them as much good as they thought it would, because ultimately most of the systems have reversed course and the schools are open again. But at what cost?
And the parents realized a lot of what was going on in the classroom that they didn't know before.
Exactly.
I was struck by what you said a moment ago, Phil, regarding what could have been done had those flawed epidemiological studies not been taken so literally and improperly in the case. I noticed that last month that the director of the Centers for Disease Control, Rochelle Walensky, made a big admission to the press. This is a quote. For 75 years, she said, CDC and public health have been preparing for COVID-19. And in our big moment, our performance did not reliably meet expectations, she said, which I guess is kind of what we're talking about indirectly here. Yeah. She acknowledged, quote, pretty dramatic, pretty public mistakes, unquote. Has the CDC come to its senses, do you think, gentlemen?
Absolutely not. And I think Rachel Walensky has been one of the worst zealots of the lockdown ideology that was embraced at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a story, I think, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that said that most of the CDC, including Walensky herself, were still working remotely, still working from home, which back here in the real world, I mean, that hasn't been the case for most private businesses since the moment the government's allowed them to reopen.
So we did see the teachers union, particularly we're talking about the American Federation of Teachers here, dictating to the CDC the language that was going to be used about schools. And very dramatically, so one of the states that was the most sane on this and the most following of the scientific truth, which Phil just laid out, namely that the elderly and people with certain things like diabetes or obesity or one another, they were the most vulnerable. And the school children, they may get it, but they get a very mild case and they're not in danger of hospitalization or dying. And the teachers weren't really particularly vulnerable either. And the teachers who were getting it from the general population, not from their students. Anyway, so one of the states that was sensible was Florida. And the Democrat who's running against Governor DeSantis, who was such a stalwart of following the science as well as liberty and common sense, Crist, who's running against him, former Republican governor of Florida, never very good in education. He's chosen as his running mate the leader of the teachers union in Miami-Dade. So he's running against DeSantis' strong point on education. So we're really going to see that election, this issue joined directly. And so it's going to kind of be a Youngkin moment, speaking of the governor race in Virginia that was very much an education cockpit. So this will be an interesting phenomenon that lockdown forces in the case of Crist and the Democrats versus DeSantis and the liberty and learning side.
It struck me when I saw that news that Charlie Crist has appointed actually not only a head of the Florida teachers union, but who had been a woman who had been the vice president of the American Federation of Teachers. Appointing her as his running mate struck me as a remarkable political blow against his own prospects.
She was a real militant. I mean, that union took, coffins and stuff to prove that and implying that DeSantis was a murderer. So, this is going to be a dramatic election race.
It may well be. You would have thought there'd be any number of other issues where Crist might have wanted to stake his identity in politics in Florida, other than I'm in favor of teachers unions.
Yeah.
Well,
Phil,
as
go ahead.
As a pollster just explained at the conference I was listening to, the public, the parents still give the teachers union amazingly a pass, and they don't really realize how yoked together the Democratic Party and the teachers union is.
The teachers unions themselves are revising their own history. We were watching Randy Weingarten.
Yes. We wanted to get back to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, is that what she's saying now?
Oh, absolutely.
She's saying that now all over the place.
But somewhere there's actually a failure of Republican candidates to explain this in understandable terms to the public.
Well, Glenn Youngkin seemed to manage it in Virginia last year,
it's
right?
Possible, right? Yeah.
It's hard to understand how the teachers union can rewrite its own recent history. But speaking of history, I mentioned at the top of the program, that historians in general have become an increasingly politicized lot. And you documented the recent case of the president of the American Historical Association, Phil, who raised the problem of presentism. Can you tell us this story, Phil? And what's going on among American historians that we should pay attention to that this shows us?
Yeah. So James Sweet is the current president of the American Historical Association, or the AHA, it's referred to it as in short. And he used his presidential column in the August newsletter of their magazine to give a very mild, cautious warning to the discipline against overindulging in political presentism, using the politics of the moment as the main lens through which they interpret the past. And his point was very salient. He says, when the politics of right now, the politics of today, shape how we interpret events from hundreds of years ago, decades ago, millennia ago, it discredits our scholarly credentials. It discredits the rigor of the discipline and the eyes of the public. And he gave examples. He's on the center left in his own politics, but he gave a couple of examples, one of which he said the New York Times' 1619 Project, which is a very presentist, highly ideological approach. But he also chastised some on the right for trying to use the recent Supreme Court case on gun rights to project backward into the way that we study the history of the Second Amendment, including in ways that I probably would disagree with his take on the Second Amendment.
He sounds kind of bipartisan there.
It is a very bipartisan, mild attack on presentism. And he's saying, look, if we historians want to continue to have reputations of credible scholars, we can't go chasing after every single political issue of the moment.
So what happened to him then?
Well, then the Twitter mob showed up. And by Twitter mob, I mean academic historians who sit there 24/7 and live tweet what's coming out of MSNBC or the Democratic Party's talking points. And what they did is they piled on the AHA's Twitter feed, posted long lists of emails of all the executive board, urging the mob to bombard them with demands that this guy be canceled, be fired from his position, or forced to resign, or forced to recant. And really venomous personal attacks. Nothing that engaged his arguments. It was all denouncing him as a white male, denouncing him as out of touch with the discipline, and asserting that activism is necessary in the discipline at the moment. And how dare you criticize the 1619 Project? I quoted one example of this. It was a historian at the University of Virginia by the name of David Walsh, who basically tweets out and says, the problem with Sweet's column was that it gave ammunition to the other side, even though it was truthful. We can't criticize the 1619 Project in truthful ways because it's going to give ammunition to the other side, and they're going to use that against us in the political arena. So therefore, he should be silenced.
So everything that historians write or say has to be calibrated by whether it's conducive or not to the contemporary left political agenda. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So you called attention to this, right? You had some stuff on your own Facebook page. Did this give you some unfavorable attention?
It did. I think I wrote the first column that actually drew attention to the controversy as it was unfolding, because I was watching it in real time, popping up on the AHA's announcements. So I wrote up a column, and that's the one that was printed in AIER and the Independent Institute, called "The Suicide of the American Historical Association." Because what happened next is that the AHA basically forced Sweet into like this Maoist struggle session of an apology, where he sends out a statement apologizing to all of the historians he has harmed with his hurtful words about the 1619 Project and their other various sacred cows of the left. And this was like within 24 hours of his column, basically begging for forgiveness from them. And what do they do next? The mob says, well, he didn't apologize enough. We still want his head. We still want him to resign. So it's just atrocious.
You called attention to this yourself, and did anyone object to you calling attention to it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So the fact that I pointed it out, the mob, of course, as they usually do, they turn on the people that are suggesting that maybe something is a little amiss here about the presentism of the discipline going into full cancellation mode. So I get hate tweets and hate mail on a regular basis. I've got thick skin from that because it's something I've been dealing with for many, many years. But it's often coming from the exact same people on the far left that put themselves forward as spokespersons for history as a discipline, spokespersons for the intellectual world, and anyone that goes against them is deserving of cancellation.
So that includes you, I guess. But you've not been canceled. Here you are on our show.
Yep.
So
I'm somewhat in a position that's insulated from those pressures by not being in the university system anymore.
Right.
But it's, I mean, the intellectual climate on campus, especially in the history discipline, has gotten significantly worse even in the last decade or so.
I think what people need to keep in mind is that the professional historians who teach history at colleges all over the country are the members of this association. They're either part of the cancel mob or they're cowering in fear in the background trying to be silent. These people, these historians are the ones who are actually teaching the people who will teach the kids in K-12. I mean, it's not, you can't just say, oh, it's a little tempest in a teapot over in that stupid liberal higher ed academe world in the ivory tower. This particular ivory tower, it spreads out and touches everyone. And this kind of thing, when you see it erupting among historians and it's a discipline of history is going bad, then you can predict that there's going to be fallout that's going to be far and wide. And you got to watch out amongst your own children and your own college students and so forth. How are they going to be taught history? By these kinds of historians.
So speaking of history, a kind of a world historical event happened in the death of Gorbachev since we last had a independent outlook. So he was an interesting character. Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, who was a one-time ally but later rival of his, said, Gorbachev thought to unite the impossible, communism with the market, public property with private property, political pluralism with the Communist Party. These are incompatible couples, but he insisted on it. So
he sounds wonderful.
Well, not really. So when he came to power in the mid-1980s as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he was a reform communist. He was a Dubček type socialism with a human face, and also called Euro-communist in those days. So so various things happened. There was a Chernobyl nuclear power accident in northern Ukraine, right at the border with Russia. And it was a disaster, and there was a cover-up. And he sort of learned from this that maybe he could work with civil society as part of his reform communism program if he opened up the media and ended censorship. So, and he also could maybe use facts from the historical past of communist history to outmaneuver his opponents within the Communist Party. So, as a result of this, some very great things happened. I mean, books like Animal Farm and 1984 by George Orwell, The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. These were all suddenly available in Russia. They hadn't been available. Dr. Zhivago by Pasternak and so forth. So this was great. Anyway, he realized that the economic situation was intolerable and untenable. And he famously told the anecdote that in the late Brezhnev years, they were having such a problem with women's pantyhose that they were going to have a special commission. Supply side problem, supply chain problem. They were going to form a commission of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to study the women's pantyhose question, led by the secretary of the Central Committee. So here was a country, as Gorbachev says, they have no tooth powder, they have no deodorant, they can't get the basics. So anyway, so he first tried workplace discipline, campaigns against alcohol. That just made him hated. And he couldn't enforce the alcohol thing. It just led to moonshine being created everywhere. And then he tried decentralizing communism. Well, it's not going to work. I mean, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, many greats of economics have shown that without private property, without prices, without capital assets that you're trying to decide what's the most profitable way to deal with them, without coordination of information by prices, you can't really have a big economy. Maybe they can copy some stuff from the free world, but fundamentally they're just going to distort things. So that was just not going to work. And so that began, they had an economic collapse. Meanwhile, Poland, that had been repressed earlier, the situation began to liberalize, and non-communists came to power in Poland. And then we're talking 1989 now. The Berlin Wall fell. And in 1990, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, declared independence. So now his fellow communists, he's been purging them and removing the ones that didn't agree with him. But anyway, there were enough left that wanted to try to keep the communist rule, communist monopoly on power, and they also wanted to keep what was left of the USSR. So they tried a coup in August 1991 while Gorbachev was on vacation. And the public and Boris Yeltsin wouldn't push back. The coup failed. But it also meant that Gorbachev's power was way diminished. So by December of that year, Yeltsin realized that he could essentially force Gorbachev totally out of power by dissolving the USSR. So he got together with the leader of Belarus and the leader of Ukraine, and they declared themselves independent outside of the USSR. And like 2 weeks later, Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR, and it was completely over. And so
now the way you're telling the story makes Gorbachev sound like he's not the one who brought about the end of communism.
Well, he tried to save it. He even used military power. He put troops who killed people into Latvia, Lithuania. He put troops into Georgia, which is not just a state in the United States, but it's also a country in the Caucasus region. And he put troops into Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim oil-producing area, kind of Persian culture influenced in the Caucasus area. And these people killed people, but he wasn't able to hold it together. And too many local communist leaders thought to take advantage of the potential dissolution. And so Gorbachev did some great things. I mean, he did this opening up of dismantling of censorship. He did allow for pluralism in elections. He had nuclear disarmament talks that resulted in real weapons dismantling with the United States. He withdrew the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. So these were really good things. But it didn't really work out. And after he left power, Yeltsin tried a genuine liberalization of the economy in the very early 1990s. And there were people like Gaidar and others that were his advisors that really tried to do this. But they didn't really have the rule of law settled. And Yeltsin himself began maneuvering a bit. So he's faced with a re-election in 1996. And in order to consolidate the power and have enough of a coalition to push himself through to the presidency, re-election to the presidency of Russia, he started making deals with the power centers around the country, the secret police people, the political people, the business people, and these became the oligarchs. And so they ended up capturing the assets of the Soviet state. So the Soviet state had owned all these business assets, and they are starting to fall apart, but they didn't have a very good method of decommunization. And so these oligarchs ended up with this, and Yeltsin kind of had to dance to their tune, and they were kind of in charge. And what happened when Putin took over from Yeltsin is Putin flipped this. So instead of the leader, Yeltsin, dancing to the tune of the oligarchs, Putin repressed the top oligarchs, and it became the mafia chieftain, the mafia don, and it became a mafia state where the oligarchs had to dance to his tune and had to be beholden to him. So let me just read two amazing epithets for Gorbachev. This is from Dmitry Furman.
I think you mean epitaphs, Bill, right?
Yeah.
Epitaphs?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, go ahead.
We make slips. The only politician in Russian history who, having full power in his hands, voluntarily opted to limit it and even risk losing it in the name of principled moral values. So he would not use force to repress the seceding satellite states like East Germany and Hungary and so forth. And again, he didn't use force much force, certainly the force that was available to him as the Soviet republics started seceding from the Soviet Union. And here's what one of the leaders, there's a still remaining classical liberal political party in Russia. Here's what one of the founding leaders of that, Grigory Yavlinsky, said. He gave freedom to hundreds of millions of people in Russia and around it, and also half of Europe. Few leaders in history have had such a decisive influence on their time. So I think those should be remarkable epitaphs. Yes.
Yes, indeed. I hope you don't mind if I put you on the spot for a moment as an economic historian. I'm sure you watched with interest that process as the Soviet Union unraveled and re-raveled somehow. Is it possible, speaking from economic history terms, is it possible for a highly centralized economic and political system to decentralize? Can it be done? The Russians attempted and failed, as Bill just narrated. Can it be done, Phil? Have you ever seen examples of where it was done successfully?
Never successfully. What always seems to play out is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. By the time that it starts to crumble and fall apart, these are decades-old problems that are just starting to rise to the surface that had been buried for political reasons. You can go back to the 1950s and basically find direct evidence that the Soviets were faking their economic statistics, overstating their industrial abilities, putting out fabricated numbers to suggest that they were ascended economically and were about to overtake the West.
Many of which were believed by the CIA, many of these numbers.
Oh, absolutely. The CIA and were published in U.S. economics textbooks. There's a famous chart in the Paul Samuelson economics textbook that always showed the Soviet Union about 20 years out was going to overtake the United States.
Yeah. I remember that textbook from college.
Yeah. And it never did. That he just update the chart and move it further and further into the future. But this is a problem with societies that are centralized because the incentive is not only there to cover up the fact that it's not working. The incentive is to actually go in the other direction and lie and pretend that everything that they are doing is successful. So it obscures the underlying structural problems. And then by the time that you get a reformer that comes along and says, wait a minute, we really need to address these, you're so far down that path of the original problem that it's just an intractable situation.
I remember watching with interest the dissolution of the Soviet system, the communist system in Czechoslovakia during the period when the major changes were occurring. And it was fascinating to me that there were many of the leading dissidents in Bohemia and what became the Czech Republic later were certainly people who in samizdat were reading some classically liberal authors like Friedrich Hayek. He was being circulated, secretly in these sometimes handwritten documents. Fascinating. And Bill mentioned just now that there remains still, even in Russia, a small classically liberal political party. And I think you mentioned that a moment ago, Bill. What's that party called?
I think it's called the United Democratic Party, but it's known by the initials of its three founders. And I'm going to possibly get it. I'm going to try it means apple in
Okay.
Russian.
Okay.
Yablov.
Okay, got it.
Yablov. Something like Yablov.
What I was in these contexts historically, those kind of groups were never huge numbers of people, but they had a lot of influence.
Right at the beginning, under Yeltsin, this party was
at the
very,
beginning.
very influential and important.
Right. Exactly, yeah. But what's fascinating is that those kind of reformers, classically liberal, if you want to use that term, they were advocating for the dissolution of the centralized state into a private ownership and liberty and the mass distribution of decision-making power politically and so forth. A very interesting point of view, which actually made them quite altruistic because if they weren't really thinking of the common good, if they were thinking only of their own personal good, they would have been vying to be the new oligarchs. But instead, they were vying to set up a system that would prevent themselves from being the new oligarchs. If only more such people predominated, some of these transitions might have gone a little differently, I suspect. What about the Chilean case, Phil? I'm just ranging a little wide here. After Pinochet, there was kind of a liberalization that did occur, a fragmentation of political power, establishment of private property. Chile went into a period of relative stability and prosperity. I thought that whole thing was going to fall apart in Chile with the left-wing riots last year, but then the Chilean voters just rejected the new proposed socialistic constitution. Is Chile possibly an example of how to move from central control to freedom?
Well, that's the fascinating thing about the Chilean example. It was not only a rejection of the new left-wing constitution, it was a decisive rejection.
Right. Overwhelming. Way more than any pollster or commentator had expected.
Exactly. And that was with the full weight of the media, full weight of academia cheering for this thing to be adopted.
And the sitting president cheering for it.
Exactly. But you had a population that, even though they've wavered between left and right, back and forth over the past several elections, I think they do fundamentally recognize the value of a liberalized economy in making the Chilean economy very prosperous, especially with respect to its neighbors in Latin America. It's the most prosperous country in the region.
Right.
And that is for a reason of political stability and institutional
political stability, rule of law, private property protected by law.
Exactly.
Yeah, may they do well. Of course, you look across the Pacific under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party saw that to survive, China probably had to loosen up state control, and it issued in a flowering of economic activity that helped. But it appears that the Chinese state is now trying to reel it back in, lest there be too much freedom in economics leading to too much freedom in thought and politics. I'm worried about the Chinese case. Can they perpetuate their movement toward greater liberty, or is it inevitable they're going to go back toward tightening, Phil?
Well, I think there's some vacillation that's occurring in there. And what'll be really interesting is what happens in Chinese politics over the next couple of years. The interesting thing here, I liken a lot of what China does to a mercantilist regime, in the sense that there are some market mechanisms that are residual from that liberalization, but there are also very, very clear state actors that are trying to manipulate it in one way or another. And what happens with mercantile regimes historically, although they're much slower for the problems to rise to the top than, say, a full socialist state, what they are very notorious for is graft and corruption and the allocation of state favors. And I think we're starting to see some of the signs of that in the Chinese economy, that firms that have received privileged positions because they have bought off politicians or because they're connected to members of the Chinese Communist Party are getting economic favors out of the government. And that's just a long run drain on economic efficiency.
Yeah,
so
it sure is. And
the Communist Party in China has tried to retain Marxism as kind of the ideological legitimating ideology. Russia gave that up and has turned instead to nationalism and even things from the old Russian pre-communist empire. Now, the interesting question is the Putin military problems, the setbacks that they're having in Ukraine, where they tried to mobilize this rebuilding of the old Tsarist Russian Empire as a national goal, is that setback going to cause Putin to lose power? It seems like, oh man, he's been there forever, decades, and how could he lose power? But they're often on a thin crust, thinner than we realize. And of course, the very great possibility is he might be replaced by somebody who's more nationalistic and more hawkish and more bellicose and belligerent. So, I mean, obviously we would hope for a liberalizing person.
Yeah.
But we should, what all these things could remind us of is that we need to be vigilant and watching for where in public life there seems to be a coalescing of state power over private activity, social and economic. Wherever you see signs of that, things are going to go wrong one way or another. So, turning back to the United States, I am somewhat, puzzled or perplexed, at least, by a lot of the debate over social media control. I mean, talk about coalescing state power over, society and communication. This is an example that it seems that the social media companies have a very distinct political tilt, and they control through their so-called moderation policies, what gets said and what gets forbidden to be said. But then the people on the other side seem to say, oh, well, we just have to force them to, share different points of view and let the state power do that. So I saw in the news that there's this civil case brought by the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana in a really novel way. I'd love both of you to comment on this. Their legal argument is that the tech giants, we're talking Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, are actually not private actors and therefore can be brought to heel through lawsuits and other government power. They're not private actors because they're actually involved in open collusion with public officials, and public officials are in fact leaning on them. And so in their so-called private moderation decisions of their platforms, they're actually doing the bidding of the political masters in Washington or in leading political circles. So therefore, they're not deserving of being treated, preserving their autonomy as private enterprises, because they're already state controlled in some ways. What do you think of this argument, gentlemen? I'm not quite sure what to make of it.
Well, it's an interesting one. And I think it's a novel argument from a necessity point of trying to get the case going. What's underlying it, though, that is absolutely undeniable is that the federal government of the United States has put direct pressure on these social media companies, Facebook and Twitter, to basically control and manipulate their content. And we've seen this directly from some of the freedom of information releases that have come out of, especially Anthony Fauci and the NIH and CDC. Those are some.
Can you give us a couple details? Can you give us a couple details on that?
I saw one of these directly myself and filed one of the FOIAs myself.
Okay.
When Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins in October 2020 basically had an email exchange that said, we need to take down the Great Barrington Declaration, doctors. And it was.
They literally said that in emails,
literally
right?
said that in an email. It went out from Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, to Fauci and all of Fauci's lieutenants, basically saying that this is a threat to our COVID policy. You need to get on the message. And that's only what we know from what they released. There's doubtless all sorts of records that were redacted. In fact, I got entire pages of redaction that show private conversations where I'm certain they went into, putting their thumb on the scale on how social media covered these things. And
well, I mean, you just narrated a government. You narrated a government official speaking to a government official, but it went then to these private companies, right?
Absolutely, because Fauci is meeting with the executives from Twitter and Facebook. The NIH is bringing them into their office and saying, well, we need your companies to police disinformation. And it turns out disinformation isn't really a scientific term. It's what the government's narrative wants to be. And that's all pro-lockdowns, pro-masks, all the things that they tried to enforce upon us.
So another case
until
was,
Rochelle.
another case was President Biden saying, "You're killing people," referring to various statements that were getting broadcast via Facebook and Twitter. And so then shortly thereafter, the social media companies and the relevant government officials start meeting and collaborating and sending messages. Are we doing enough of what you want? Or the question that's being raised. So this, they're killing people, in a sense, is similar to the Great Barrington Declaration shutdown.
Yeah, take them down.
I want to say that Phil isn't quite trumpeting himself enough. The Great Barrington refers to the site of the think tank that Phil is at, the American Institute for Economic Research, who sponsored this meeting of high-level doctors who drafted this statement in favor of science and liberty in the face of the COVID lockdown.
And then, of course, there was the recent admission by Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook that he had responded to cues from the federal government in participating in the suppression of the story about the Hunter Biden laptop.
Right.
So in all these instances, the thread I'm seeing, it's common, there seems to be a kind of extension of government power over these private companies. Does this really call into question their private status? What should be done about this?
I think we want to preserve their. No, I think it's a problem, and we want to try and preserve their private and independent status. I don't think the argument that many on the left and some on the right argue is, well, they should be turned into either public utilities or the near equivalent with various carry mandates of public utilities. I think that's
what could be worse.
Well, I think I think that would not be good for freedom. But I do think we need to get more firewalls, more protections, more causes of action that can push back against federal intrusion and federal manipulation. So it's funny that the cover-up people, though, don't seem to be having any problems in life. The FBI agent who was in charge of this, pursuing the Hunter Biden thing, just recently resigned, but without any, he resigned with honor, so to speak. And another guy who was involved in the letter of the 51 intelligence officers claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Soviet plant and the creation of the the Russian secret police. Sorry about that Soviet. I'm living with Gorbachev here. Anyway, he just got promoted to a White House intelligence board. So these people are thriving that have done this, and it's an unfortunate situation. They should be shamed. They should be not given positions of honor and responsibility.
So, for example, this lawsuit from the attorneys general from Missouri and Louisiana, I'm not sure that I want it to succeed, but I do think that those kind of things are going to give the leaders of these big social media companies pause that maybe they shouldn't just be so cravenly submissive to government power. Let them be private, make their own private decisions. They should resist government influence. And to those on the further on the right who say, oh, we should just control them all. I think, what they're basically saying is that since some government control of social media is bad, we should have even more government control of social media.
And they're forgetting that it's not going to be conservatives that are in charge of the government all the time. It's going to be
that's right.
Can they imagine Bernie Sanders doing this? Can they imagine AOC doing this? If they would pause and think logically, they would step back from this.
One of the beauties of the No, go ahead.
The best outcome that comes from the lawsuits is that it shines the light on all this documentation. It brings all the public records to before not only the heads of the companies, but before the general public, and embarrasses and shames those companies for directly colluding with the political whims of the Biden administration.
So there's
one of the beauties.
There's something that
Go
I
ahead, Bill.
wish shined more light on something else, and that is this whole Mar-a-Lago dispute ought to be shining light on the system of overclassification in the federal government.
Yes.
I mean, top people going back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan have complained that 100 times what is reasonable to be classified is classified. They just stamp classified on everything. And to me, it's sort of strange that people involved in this dispute are just saying, oh, well, the such and such document was classified, but, everything is classified. So that's a kind of a bizarre aspect of this Mar-a-Lago raid. And another thing is that more light should have been shined on, and really very few people, I count Independent Institute's Ivan Eland as one who has done this, but very few people have pointed out how vague and shoddy the Espionage Act of the World War I era is in terms of encompassing everything. You cause doubt to fall on the military, cause whatever. I mean, people who argued against World War I were treated as foreign spies. They had nothing to do with being spies. So there's a whole history of this being used to suppress free speech, and a much more narrowly tailored law could protect against real secrets and selling them or giving them to foreign foes. And, somehow the dispute has been a personal one over the sloppiness and country club site versus the arrogance and rummaging in the private closets of the president's wife, or former first lady. I mean, that's all interesting, but there are major public policy issues that are at stake here.
And Senator Rand Paul, has apparently called for reform of that very act, if I understand. It could push it in the direction
he deserves
Bill.
a lot of credit for that, and also for calling out Fauci again and again.
Exactly.
He just did that the other day, and he has been, he began doing that when Fauci was God, and he took tremendous courage for him to stand up to Fauci. And but he's continuing to do it. He just he just found an old tape of Fauci with reference to flu vaccines. Fauci being asked, well, does somebody need a flu vaccine if they just had the flu? And he's acknowledging, no, that gives them some immunity, and so they don't need to have a flu shot. So then Rand Paul says, well, why aren't you applying this immunological logic to COVID? Because you never seem to be counting the people who have protection from having had COVID when you're dealing with policy. And Fauci just sort of stumbles around and says, well, the vaccine gives them a little extra protection. But he doesn't really say, why aren't you doing research on how much extra protection or whether they can avoid the stream? He is also questioning, why are we giving children these vaccines that there's the newest one that really only tested on mice. I mean, I've had all the vaccines and boosters. I'm not against this, but I do think that Rand Paul is performing an immense public service in raising these questions.
Yeah. I think we should probably adjourn for the day, friends. We've been at this for a little while here. Thank you both so much for talking about all these different subjects. And we thank our friends who join us in watching us and thinking about these issues with us. There is a common thread among a lot of the concerns we've discussed today, which has to do with avoiding the crystallization, the hardening of government power over all different parts of the social and economic life. Wherever that can be resisted, we're probably going to be a whole lot better off. And so thank you for commenting from that kind of perspective, Bill Evers and Phil Magnus. And Phil, I just want to point out to our friends once again that they can turn to our website, independent.org, and they'll find your piece on the American Historical Association there. Any other work that you're doing recently that you want to draw attention of our friends to?
Well, the next big project will be looking at how Karl Marx basically made his way into the U.S. university system from being this obscure, rejected, obsolete economist in the late 19th century to now one of the most commonly taught figures in the humanities.
Seems like only in the former communist countries has he lost credibility, but in curricular circles in the West, yeah, now he's going to be revered. Okay, we're going to watch for that new research from Phil Magnus regarding Karl Marx in the curriculum. Have I got that right?
Yep.
Looking
Thank you,
looking
Phil.
forward to seeing that,
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Graham.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Pleasure to talk to both of you, and we invite our friends to join us next time on Independent Outlook. See you again. Bye-bye.